Lena knelt on her front lawn, tying her bootlaces. 2 patrol cars approached, slowing as they neared her. One officer issued a command. "Ma'am, step away from your property and keep your hands visible." Both officers were already positioned, with their hands near their holsters, preparing for a possible escalation. The younger officer quickly checked his radio. "Suspect is armed female. Possible threat. Neighborhood complaint," he reported. His words were abrupt and calculated. Lena paused, her focus still on the task at hand. She was simply preparing for her day, nothing out of the ordinary. Her sidearm, holstered at her hip, was fully within her rights to carry. The older officer's eyes shifted as he processed the situation. He stared at Lena, realizing his mistake. "You're Chief Lena West, aren't you?" His voice dropped in recognition, and his posture shifted as if he were faced with someone unexpected. The younger officer followed his lead, retreating slightly as the realization set in. The conflict between Lena and Margaret had been brewing for months. Margaret Clark, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had secured her position through manipulation and a series of questionable tactics. Having served for 3 consecutive terms, she wielded significant power in the neighborhood, dictating rules that bordered on the unreasonable. Her authority was uncontested, and any attempt to challenge it resulted in fines or public reprimands. Margaret viewed the HOA as an extension of her personal domain. The rules she enforced were arbitrary, yet strictly upheld overgrown grass, improperly stored items, and even trivial offenses such as the improper placement of a trash can were subject to fines. Her grip on the neighborhood was reinforced by selective enforcement and a history of intimidating residents into compliance. She had long used her position to control the community, often punishing those who dared question her decisions. Lena, recently appointed as the new police chief, had moved into the neighborhood with a reputation for fairness and dedication. She was determined to live quietly, focusing on her professional responsibilities and maintaining her personal rights. However, her stance on gun rights quickly put her at odds with Margaret, whose views on public safety were more restrictive. The incident that escalated the conflict occurred a few days prior, when Margaret approached Lena in her own yard. As Lena was tending to her garden, Margaret pointed at the holstered sidearm Lena wore while off duty. "That's against HOA rules," Margaret had declared, her tone accusatory. "You'll be fined." Lena, undeterred, calmly explained that she was legally carrying the weapon, in full compliance with state law. She informed Margaret that the HOA had no jurisdiction over personal firearms, especially when carried by an off-duty officer. Margaret's response was dismissive. "You're supposed to be setting an example," she said, as she turned and walked away. The threat of a fine hung in the air, but Lena knew that Margaret's reach didn't extend that far. Margaret, not one to accept rejection, vowed to escalate the matter. She had already demonstrated her willingness to bend the rules to suit her needs, and this was just another challenge she intended to face head-on. The next move came quickly. 2 days later, Lena, unaware of the storm Margaret had set in motion, stepped outside to start her day. The officers arrived soon after, responding to a false 911 call placed by Margaret, claiming Lena was an armed threat. This was the culmination of Margaret's months-long campaign against Lena, a final, calculated attempt to force Lena to comply with her vision of order. Margaret had hoped to use the police response as leverage, hoping to intimidate Lena into following her restrictive rules. However, the officers, upon realizing Lena's identity, were forced to confront the truth. They had been misled, and the situation quickly became one of recognition, not confrontation. The series of events triggered by this false alarm would mark the beginning of a much larger battle for control of the neighborhood. Margaret's authority, once unchallenged, was about to unravel as Lena's rightful position as both a leader and a resident came to the forefront. Margaret's actions quickly led to consequences that she had not anticipated. The officers, recognizing the error they had made by responding to a false report, apologized promptly. They acknowledged that they were simply acting on the information provided, but the weight of their misunderstanding became clear. Lena, without expressing frustration or anger, accepted their apology and focused on the root cause of the situation. Her attention shifted to Margaret, whose role in the incident was now undeniable. Lena calmly addressed Margaret, pointing out that filing a false police report was a crime. The gravity of the situation was immediate, and the legal implications for Margaret were apparent. The accusatory tone was not for show. It was a simple, fact-based statement of the law. Margaret, once self-assured in her manipulation of others, found herself at a loss for words. Her attempt to deflect responsibility faltered when she mumbled an excuse. She didn't know it was Lena. She had assumed the officer was simply another person, someone who could be ignored. Lena did not let the excuse distract her from the point at hand. She made it clear that Margaret's actions had endangered the officers, the community, and herself. Her focus remained on the violation of the law, not on Margaret's excuses. It was a direct confrontation of the facts, and Margaret's position became increasingly untenable. Margaret had underestimated the resolve of Lena, not recognizing the broader implications of falsely accusing someone, who was not just a neighbor but also the police chief. The immediate consequences for Margaret became clearer as her influence began to erode. As the day passed, Lena began receiving messages of support from the very community Margaret had sought to control. Several neighbors, who had long been subjected to Margaret's heavy-handed tactics, approached Lena to express their solidarity. The neighbors, many of whom had been wary of speaking out against Margaret for fear of retribution, now saw an opportunity to stand against the HOA president's overreach. This support was not merely an expression of sympathy. It signaled a shift in the balance of power within the neighborhood. Residents who had been passive participants in Margaret's reign now realized the potential for collective action. They no longer feared her arbitrary fines or the threats of social ostracism. Margaret's authority had always been contingent upon the fear and division she sowed among the residents, and with that foundation crumbling, her control started to slip away. Lena, though still processing the events, recognized the significance of this shift. The trust of her neighbors, which she had worked to earn throughout her career, had been solidified by this crisis. Her position as police chief was no longer just a professional role. It had become a mantle of leadership within the community. She had acted not only to protect the law, but also to protect her neighbors from the corruption and manipulation that had been festering under Margaret's rule. The support from the residents was not just a personal victory for Lena. It marked the beginning of a broader community effort to challenge Margaret's authority. A quiet rebellion had formed, one that had been building for years. Unnoticed by the HOA president, Margaret's actions had inadvertently united the residents, revealing the strength of their collective will. The following evening, as the neighborhood began to rally behind Lena, the full extent of Margaret's actions and their repercussions began to unfold. The support was not just for Lena's position, but for the values of fairness and integrity that she represented. This moment, though seemingly small in the context of the broader power dynamics, marked a significant shift in the neighborhood's social fabric. Margaret's grip on the community had been loosened, and Lena, through her measured response, had become the figurehead of a movement for transparency and justice. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had now turned into a turning point for the neighborhood, one that would ultimately reshape the HOA's influence and the relationships within the community. The following day, Margaret, refusing to acknowledge the consequences of her actions, distributed a newsletter throughout the neighborhood. The publication was filled with accusations aimed at Lena, including claims that she had brandished a weapon in public, caused fear among residents, and misused her power as police chief. Margaret framed Lena as a divisive figure, portraying her presence in the community as threatening and abusive. However, Lena did not respond to these claims with more accusations or public rebuttals. Instead, she methodically compiled the necessary evidence to refute Margaret's false narrative. Lena gathered 911 call transcripts, body cam footage, and formal complaints related to Margaret's harassment. Armed with this documentation, she sent it directly to the city attorney for review. This proactive, evidence-based approach left little room for debate or denial, ensuring that the facts would take precedence over the smear campaign. Margaret had initiated the city council meeting that followed marked a pivotal moment. Lena presented the evidence in a clear and concise manner, revealing the extent of Margaret's manipulation. She highlighted Margaret's tactics, including the anonymous letters she had circulated to stir division, her unilateral decision-making in the and her pattern of issuing fines without proper votes or approvals from the board. One council member, upon reviewing the facts, remarked in disbelief, "I thought the HOA was supposed to maintain order, not create a dictatorship." As the council absorbed the details, it became clear that Margaret's control over the neighborhood was eroding. Her actions had not only endangered the community's well-being, but had also exposed the flaws in her leadership. The room shifted, and the balance of power began to tilt in Lena's favor. The next stage in Margaret's efforts to retain control came at an emergency HOA meeting. Margaret pushed for a weapons ban in the neighborhood, using the false 911 call as evidence that Lena's presence, as an armed individual, posed a threat. However, this move backfired. A member of the community stood up, addressing the room with clarity and conviction. "You lied about our police chief, and you endangered all of us." The message was clear. Margaret's credibility had been compromised. Margaret, desperate to regain her position, attempted to intimidate the group, saying, "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." Yet, her threats held no weight in the face of mounting evidence and the unanimous support for Lena. When the vote was cast, it was overwhelming. 28 votes in favor of removing Margaret from her position, 2 in favor of retaining her, and 1 abstention. Margaret's downfall was swift and decisive. Defeated, Margaret stormed out of the room, her plans shattered. Her influence, once absolute, had been dismantled through a combination of transparency, accountability, and the community's willingness to stand up for what was right. The battle for control of the neighborhood was now officially over, and Lena had emerged as the clear leader. Margaret's control began to unravel. Quickly after the city attorney's investigation into the missing HOA funds, a thorough review uncovered $75,000 in misappropriated funds, which were linked directly to Margaret. The findings were clear, and Margaret's ability to manipulate the community through fear and false authority had reached its end. Once considered an unassailable leader, she now found herself backed into a corner, unable to justify her actions. Margaret's response to these revelations was another attempt to shift blame. She granted a media interview, hoping to use it as an opportunity to spread more lies about Lena. However, this only compounded her problems. The reporter who interviewed her had a personal history with Lena. His son had been rescued by Lena from a house fire years earlier. This connection led the reporter to reject Margaret's story, refusing to print the slanderous claims. Instead, he shared his experience with the public, further diminishing Margaret's credibility. At the next HOA meeting, Margaret's position was no longer secure. Neighbors who had previously been hesitant to oppose her now openly expressed their support for Lena. The tide had turned. They praised Lena's actions, her leadership, and her dedication to the community, while denouncing Margaret's tactics. The once strong grip Margaret had on the neighborhood had disintegrated, and her final move to regain control was to file a defamation lawsuit against Lena, accusing her of undermining her reputation. However, the lawsuit quickly fell apart. During the proceedings, chat logs surfaced that revealed Margaret had been mocking Lena and discussing plans to remove her from the community. The evidence was clear, and the case was dismissed by the judge. The court warned Margaret that her false claims had caused unnecessary disruption and warned her against continuing with baseless accusations. Margaret's attempts to fight back had only led to her further discrediting. In the wake of her defeat, Margaret's reputation in the neighborhood was irreparably damaged. Her name became synonymous with corruption and deceit. The community, once fractured by fear of her power, began to heal. The residents who had once been intimidated into silence now rallied together, and in their unity, they dismantled the toxic system Margaret had put in place. Margaret's assets, including her home, were soon seized. The house went up for sale and ultimately became bankrupt. The remaining HOA funds, tied to her fraudulent activities, were scrutinized, and the legal charges against her piled up: fraud, illegal surveillance, and misuse of funds. She had been living under the guise of authority for too long, and now, all the lies and manipulations she had relied on were coming to light. Lena, in contrast, remained a figure of quiet resolve. Throughout the ordeal, she had not relied on force or confrontation, but on clear evidence and the support of the community. Her approach was methodical, calculated, and focused on the facts. She did not seek public adoration or glory. Her priority had always been to protect the neighborhood and its residents. In the end, her leadership had proven to be exactly what the community needed. As Margaret's influence disintegrated, the neighborhood began to rebuild. The fractured community had found strength in their collective efforts to remove the source of their division. Lena's role had evolved from that of a police chief to the guardian of the community's integrity. She was no longer just a leader in her professional capacity. She had become a protector of the neighborhood's values. The storm of Margaret's reign had passed, and with it, the neighborhood found peace. Lena, though still humble in her victory, knew that the greatest triumph was the unity that had emerged. Through patience, evidence, and the unwavering support of those around her, Lena had led the way in dismantling a corrupt system, restoring integrity to the community.